Welcome. I'm KGB or Cheeb. I began building my version of Fjordland after Chris Brammer relit a fire in me to begin playing Workers and Resources again. I'd considered picking up an old playthrough and continuing with it, but both he and Kaya suggested I start Fjordland map, and I thought that would be interesting. We could compare notes and screenshots and see what direction we went. It's a decision I'm more than happy I made. Chris, Kaya, and Oliki encouraged me to give YouTube a try. I was initially against the idea, but their badgering convinced me to try. I began by recording a couple of small test videos that were not good, but with their good coaching, I was able to produce something that was acceptable. And if you haven't, please check out Chris, Kaya, and Oliki's channels. They're worth your time. I realized starting with a map that's well on its way is not a traditional Workers and Resources presentation, but I really wanted to continue with this map. I thought a tour video would be a good way to introduce you to what has been done up to now. And from there, I could continue planning, building, and asking your advice. Then I thought, what if I wrote a backstory that explains some of the highs and lows of my Fjordland journey? It might be entertaining and would certainly be a challenge. Let's get started with a story I've called Tri Magnata. Christoph Bramsky emigrated to Fjordland with the initial wave of settlers looking for a new home and opportunity. He was an ambitious, hard-working man that toiled tirelessly on Fjordland's first settlement. Picking up every job he could, he worked on housing, the construction industry, and even technical services, ensuring the roads were plowed in winter so the trucks bringing the much-needed supplies to the new settlement were not delayed. He was also instrumental in setting up logistics for the imported materials, and during this time became a master of how to do business the Soviet Republic way. He also found time to guide the construction industry. He was involved in selection of the vehicles, which roads to build, and even helped design buildings the new immigrants would live in. In short, he embodied Fjordland. With all the contacts he'd made during this time, and his ability to save every ruble he earned, Christoph had put himself in a position to build the first major industry in Fjordland, coal, a key component to any thriving republic. In less than a year, Christoph managed to plan and build the coal mine and coal processing plant that was needed to get Fjordland on its feet. The balance sheet was starting to look better. His appetite for business had just been whetted. The coal industry was so profitable that it was able to fund further growth for the Republic. In no time, he had plans for a gravel industry that would knock another import off Fjordland's list and fuel his fledgling company. Christoph's side of the future kept Fjordland moving forward. Bramsky Gravel Works had been built. This took Fjordland out of the dirt road backwoods era and into a new and promising future, one of on-time deliveries and, yes, more profit. Having heard Fjordland was full of promise and dreams, the Myadska family emigrated to Fjordland. They were a large, tight-knit family with 4 boys and 1 girl, Kailinka. Kailinka found work in the offices of Bramsky Construction, and the boys worked on the construction crews where they were quickly promoted. Kailinka and the boys were like sponges, absorbing all the knowledge they could. They now had almost everything they needed to create a business venture of their own. Over evening meals, the Myadskas discussed a myriad of plans for Fjordland and how they could be part of the move to the next level. They finally settled on a small iron ore deposit in the south on land the Myadska family had access to. You see, Kailinka had not just been flirting with Christoph during those endless meetings. She'd been collecting information on how to do business in Fjordland. Kailinka had steel in her eyes, but how to get there. Sadly, the Myadska family didn't have the economic resources needed to complete a full-on steel mill. Kailinka had worked for the Bramsky Construction Company for a few years now. She knew the business, and she knew what made Christoph tick: rubles. She approached Christoph with an adequate business plan, and a partnership with the Bramsky Construction Company was forged. Christoph knew with minimal investment, he could have a say in the steel industry he needed for his planned rail network. And the meetings with the Myadskas would allow him to see Kailinka from time to time outside work. Win-win. The Bramsky Myadska Steel Works was built and would be the primary source of steel for the next decade. Truly a huge milestone for Fjordland. The future was bright. This next decade saw booming growth for Fjordland. Having steel made locally and used in everything that was built meant the Republic was now profitable. Christoph's train dream became a reality. He was now exporting resources by the trainload. It seemed like the trains were being filled with rubles for their return trip. The Myadskas, however, were not quite as happy as Christoph was. Kalinka's business plan had neglected one detail. Rail connection for their iron stores had been overlooked, and an opportunity to grow their budding empire had been missed. Kalinka was furious with herself and vowed to never let a misstep like that happen again. That said, the Bramski-Myadska partnership did fuel the growth of Fjordland. The Myadskas had a very comfortable life. The population doubled, there were jobs for everyone, and people flocked to Fjordland. Not one to sit on his laurels, though, Christoph seized the opportunity to invest more heavily in the construction industry. First the fit brick factory, fed by his endless supply of coal, then the cement plant, again fed by Christoph's resources. And building the prefab panel factory completed his dream of cornering the construction supply industry in Fjordland. Now, virtually everything built in Fjordland would line the pockets of Christoph Bramski. Kalinka was looking for a way to make up for her earlier mistake. She saw an opportunity that Christoph had somehow overlooked. Everyone needs food. In the remaining parcel of land, Kalinka put her brothers to work building a moderately sized farm meant to supply their newly built food factory and chicken huts. The Myadskas' coffers began to fill. In order to keep his massive resource inventory turning over and ensure the Myadskas didn't beat him to it, Christoph commissioned an export supply hub. It would take as much excess material as possible and make it available for export or distribution by his trade. He also brought to life a new district in Fjordland, one he wanted to be a vibrant, colorful, and money-making venture. It was a great success and filled almost immediately. As a result of Christoph's successes, the Fjordland City Council voted unanimously to rename Fjordland Bramski. Christoph's legacy had now been cemented. Trying desperately not to be outdone, Kalinka had discovered oil in the south. Her eye was on the future, a future tied as loosely as possible to Christoph Bramski. She couldn't pass up this opportunity, no matter the cost. Convincing her family to sell their iron processing and their interest in the steel business was not easy. In fact, it nearly tore the family apart. They had done well for themselves and were living well, albeit in Christoph's shadow. Kalinka wanted more for them and for herself. In the end, her will, determination, and business sense won them over. Shovels were now in the ground for the town of Myadzol. Kalinka and her brothers set in motion the plans for a beautiful city that had stunning views of the mountains and vistas that overlooked the sea. A marvel of a train station that could provide workers for the industries she knew the Republic would need was built. Its scale and beauty had not been seen in Fjordland and would set the benchmark for all future cities. Kalinka wanted everyone to have easy access to all the amenities the city had to offer. She planned a special bus route that would take citizens to every part of the city, one of her proudest achievements. The pump jacks and forwarding stations were built and fed a massive storage tank. She knew that tank was the key to her family's future. Keep it full, and the rubles from export and processing it into fuel and bitumen would flow. Kalinka's aspirations didn't end there. She knew how to turn construction work into rubles. Her time in the Bramski construction offices would serve the family well. She set up the needed industries, and she set them up better than Christoph had, complete with plans for helicopters. The only drawback she could see was having to buy the materials from her former partner. As time wore on, it became obvious there was not enough fuel to start up her beloved helicopter construction office, despite the fact a second factory had been built. Firing up the fuel-hungry helicopters could run the Republic out of fuel. This was not an option, yet. Myadzol was a resounding success. The residences filled in record time, and the first half of the city was now complete. The nearby iron ore processing almost made Kalinka feel at home. Myadska's empire was growing. Enter a brash young Myadzol-born entrepreneur, Ulyav Kiamnov. His is the first Republic-born success story. He came to riches by maintaining a fleet of fuel trucks, and as often the case, fueled his desire for more. His eye was on an impressive coal supply next to Myadzol, and while he could fund most of the cost of the coal production facilities, he couldn't fund the complete vision. Coal, steel, and power were in his grasp. How to make that happen. A fortuitous meeting at Myadzol's city anniversary celebration, held at the Republic-famous amphitheater, would bring a fruitful partnership. Ulyav and Kalinka were introduced at intermission and struck up a conversation. They found common ground discussing their businesses, and Kalinka was impressed with Uliov's fearlessness. She agreed to meet the following day to discuss the potential of a partnership. The meeting went well and gave birth to the Brospine Coal, Steel, and Power Company. The Republic was not prepared for the scale of this business venture. Think big, and big is what they built. On completion, the area would be able to supply all the coal, steel, and power for generations to come. But as is often the case, other facts come into play that could not be anticipated. Using trains to supply workers for the 4 major factories congested the railways, slowed down production, and often left trains full of workers being blocked and delivering a scant few to the factories. Power would intermittently drop out. Steel production was a shadow of what it should be. Is bigger always better? There had to be a solution. It came in the form of a cableway. Uliov, fresh from a vacation to Tajgador, had experienced his first cableway ride. He surmised using a cableway to bring workers to the power plant could ensure a steady supply of workers and, as a bonus, take a few trains off the tracks. He presented the idea to Kalinka, and in short order they had built the Republic's first cableway, and it was a resounding success. What an interesting commute. The power outages stopped, and the trains bringing workers to the coal and steel plants were now full of workers. Success. Or so they thought. There was more than one layer to this onion. While the coal industry was thriving, the steel industry was not producing anywhere near the amount it should. Both Kalinka and Uliov were troubled. What was the problem? As it turns out, fixing the worker problem revealed a flaw in the design of the steel production supply chain. How could a 4,000-ton iron storage not be able to supply the steel mill? Uliov and Kalinka were dumbfounded. How had this been overlooked? They had underestimated how much iron was needed for such a large factory, and to add to the woes, they had built a storage facility with only one rail line for unloading. Rail was supposed to enable the next level in steel production, not be the bottleneck. They'd pored over the area plans, trying to figure out how to get steel production where it, and they needed it to be. Build another storage. Not enough space. Tear down the existing storage and build a proper one. Can't turn off steel production and kill cash flow. Almost together, they saw the solution. The steel mill itself had 3 rail connections that weren't being used. Normally they would be used to pick up steel for delivery, but the original plans had a massive storage for steel, so these lines had not been used. Research indicated the rail could be used to drop off iron, but they had never done anything like this before and were unsure. Not to mention they would need to figure out how to get a rail line into such a cramped space. They left this to their engineers to figure out. And figure it out they did. Somehow they wedged a rail line in with access to the mill. Train routes were reconfigured, and the first shipment of iron proved the theory. Now, with one train delivering iron to the storage and one to the mill itself, steel production doubled. Sadly, it was still not enough iron for the hungry mill. An initially controversial decision was made to stop exporting iron and redirect the train to the mill. So many unanswered questions. More train traffic. Will the rail get backed up again? Will the loss of the export put a strain on cash flow? Will one train be enough? The answers were no, no, and yes. The rail network was fine. The increased steel export more than covered the cost, the loss of revenue from iron export, and one more train kept the mill producing 24/7. Success. Success, that is, until the food and meat crisis of 1989. The influx of workers had pushed food and meat production beyond its capacity. With Kalinka's family knowledge of the food industry, a large production area was set up, complete with supporting farm and rail. And thanks to Kalinka's state-of-the-art construction offices in Myadzol, it was up and running in record time. Importing food and meat could now be stopped. They both breathed a sigh of relief when revenue returned to pre-crisis levels. While the coal and steel area was producing record amounts of steel, there were slower times when the factories were not fully staffed. With the new food area taking some of the workers elsewhere, it was now time to build the second half of Myadzol. Not only would this keep the factories staffed, it would complete Kalinka's vision of her city and allow for some economic growth. The construction offices were set in motion and the city was completed. Kalinka beamed. Grain exports and the selection of the right resources had made Kalinka and Uliov vast fortunes. However, they both knew that to make real money, exporting by ship was the way to go. Again, fortune shined down on them as a perfect location was at hand. Great access to the Soviet border, and the rail lines were a stone's throw away. The accountants in their employ warned of the cause, as accountants are known to do. Starting up this venture would require an amount of capital that neither had fully realized until now. A harbor was needed, as well as the storage facilities to feed the ships heading to the border. No small investment. Not to mention the refueling facilities and the large amount of fuel to be delivered on a regular basis. This was when the accountant looked up, peered over the top of their glasses, and muttered, "Have we forgotten about building these ships?" The full impact of this decision suddenly weighed down on Kalinka and Ulia. A new dream had been dreamt, and it was money holding them back? Preposterous. But the reality of the situation could not be ignored. Somewhat hesitantly, Uliov floated the idea of approaching Christoph and becoming partners in this expensive endeavor. Neither were completely sold on the idea. Christoph was self-made, fiercely independent, and a shrewd businessman, evidenced by Kalinka's not-so-distant dealings with him. But in the end, they agreed that a nothing-ventured, nothing-gained attitude was needed, and there was much to be gained. A meeting was set up with Christoph, and to their surprise, he accepted almost immediately. His Bramski holdings could run on their own with little to no input, testament to his business skills. In reality, Christoph had accepted because he was bored and needed a new challenge, and a challenge it would be. He knew little of Uliov other than his reputation, and Kalinka had grown since their last venture. She was not the same wide-eyed person she was when they had last dealt. Not to mention that none of them had experience in the shipping industry. Boring this would not be. Partnership details were worked out. Everyone was happy with the results of the negotiations. Prime Magnata was formed, with planning and construction soon follow. A ruble-colored cloud seemed to hover over these three. During the groundworks phase, a vast supply of oil was discovered. Prime Magnata could be seen dancing in the streets of Mayadzol. Plans were drawn up to extract as much oil as possible from the ground to store for future use. They knew many of the future industries they needed would require oil. And if they were exporting aggregates, how much more could it cost to export liquids? Economies of scale could be argued. It would be some time before the true profits of this decision would be realized, but its potential could not be ignored. The pumpjack field and storages were built. Back to the story at hand. To facilitate exporting by ship, a dry dock was needed, and it requires 500 workers per ship. Not a number Kalinka nor Christoph felt they could supply. They decided Uliov would take charge of planning and building a city capable of supplying these workers. Kiamnov now had a spot on the map. This left building the infrastructure for the port areas and dry dock to Christoph and Kalinka. The roles they fell into felt natural and familiar, like putting on your favorite pair of gloves. Kalinka's construction offices sprang into action. Christoph's supply chain roared to life. In no time, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the dry dock was being planned. It was not all rosy, though. The construction of Kiamnov was months behind schedule, and Uliov had planned a city 3 times the size needed for the dry dock. What was he doing? During Trimagnata's first meeting in months, both Kalinka and Christoph expressed concern about the lack of progress in the new city. It was supposed to be done around the same time the dry dock was done. They needed answers. Uliov's reply was, "Hey ho, that's the way the cookie crumbles," and then burst out laughing. Once his laughter had subsided, he said, "I wish I had a camera to capture the look on your faces forever. It would always make me smile." He then offered up the real reason for the delay. "Kalinka," he said, "I received reports that our food and meat production was out of crops for half the year. The only reason we didn't notice was our warehouses were so well stocked that the cities never drained them. If we had brought Kiamnov online with this situation, we would have risked bringing the whole republic down. Not something I wanted to be responsible for. I tried to reach you for days, but none of my calls were answered. You wouldn't have perhaps been skiing in the Alps by chance?" At this, Kalinka blushed and made an almost imperceptible glance towards Christoph, whose head was shaking. Seems not all secrets were secret anymore. Uliov smiled and said, "So I took it on myself to build another farm. I need to ensure our workers have something to do. I don't want my rubles producing nothing." After the uncomfortable exchange, they agreed to adjourn the meeting and convene in the morning. The morning meeting was a huge success. They figured out how to get the Kiamnov construction back on track and planned out some new industries that would fit nicely into their current plans. A new chemical factory would be built, making use of some of their new oil reserves, and introduced a new industry, woodcutting. However, there was still an issue of getting workers to the new plant. Kalinka studied Mayadzol's population statistics and determined it could supply around half the needed workers for the new plant. It would be a decent start, and chemicals, even in small numbers, would be quite lucrative. Christoph, ever the entrepreneur, had spent the prior evening in meetings with his advisors and had come up with a plan that would kill two birds. Building a fabric and clothing industry close to the dry dock would not only provide fabric for the dry dock, but would remove another import from the Republic's ledgers, and there would likely be enough left to export and add to their bottom lines, something they agreed was a good thing. That afternoon, they finalized the plans and arranged the needed financing. This change in plans was well beyond the initial plan and not something you could just write a check for. Kalinka's brothers were put in charge of the construction of a small farm, yes, another farm, redirecting crops from the food chain to the clothing chain, given Uliov's recent experience, could not be risked. This new farm would be dedicated to the fabric factories and was needed to keep the looms humming. A few months later, everything was on track. Kiamnov was finally populated, the essential services up and running, and an initial, failed attempt was made to get the first Lubnau ore carrier christened. 2 buses bringing people to a project that requires 150,000 man-hours to complete was unrealistic, and it put a major strain on the ability to staff the heating plant adequately. It was agreed they needed to show some patience and let Kiamnov grow to a size that would allow enough workers to be sent to the dry dock. Efforts were redoubled to finish the next 2 sets of housing in Kiamnov. They were finally completed. During the settling of those buildings, a major engineering blunder was discovered. In their haste to get the plans drawn up, Uliov's engineers had miscalculated the electricity coverage needed for the city. It was only revealed after the citizens that had moved in began complaining. A new substation would have to be built, complete with underground cables. Not an overnight solution, but the only one that could be made. Fortunately, it was summer, which minimized the impacts of the error and saved the engineer a long, lonely, cold trip to the frozen north. While Kiamnov was being built, Kalinka used her spare time to take what she'd learned about the woodcutting industry and round out her industry portfolio. To Kalinka, the amount of land used for the oil industry seemed a waste. The space left between the pump jacks and forwarding pumps could and should be used. With a small investment in equipment and materials, Mayadzal was now in the lumber business. This brings you up to date with my Fjordland playthrough. Hope you enjoyed the story and my version of Fjordland. Hope to see you in the next one.